We are carrying on our study in the Gospel of Matthew. In this study, we are looking at chapter 1 and verses 22 and 23. Now, all this happened in order to make come true what the Lord had said through the prophet. A virgin will become pregnant and have a son, and he will be called Emmanuel, which means God is with us. Each of the four Gospels have emphases that are unique to themselves. Now, to say this is not to say that they disagree or thought some issues were unimportant. It seems it is rather that each saw certain points, issues as important. In the case of the Gospel of Matthew, we have the most Jewish of the four Gospels. In light of that, it's not surprising that Matthew takes a lot of energy to make sure that people see that Jesus' ministry is a fulfillment of the Old Testament. And so you read the Gospel of Matthew and you find references like these verses to Scripture fulfilled in the life and work of Jesus. Luke was written by a Gentile to a Gentile audience. It is not that the idea of Jesus as fulfillment of the Old Testament was unimportant, but rather it was not an idea which would have had the same power with a Gentile audience. Let's look at another example of this principle at work. If we turn to Acts chapter 17, we have the story of Paul's visit to Athens. Now, Paul did not go to a synagogue, according to the account in the book of Acts. We probably can assume that there was not one to go to, or Paul just chose not to go. Now, Athens, of course, as a city, had a long history of intellectual reflection and speculation. It was a place where Paul chose to go a different route. You see, in this city, there were all sorts of temples and shrines to various gods, including an unknown god mentioned in Acts 17:23. Paul uses this unknown God to begin his proclamation of the gospel message. What Paul was not doing was downplaying the importance of what we call the Old Testament. Paul knew that to start from sacred scripture would close the conversation. What Paul brilliantly did was start on something they could agree and understand. What Paul knew and knew well was how to put scriptures into the language of the people he was dealing with. What is more important, the thought or the words of scripture? You see, it is the thought. If you have ever dealt with cults of a Christian origin, you will find them quite adept at quoting scripture in exact form. Try and discuss the ideas of those scriptures, that's another issue. Paul was able to take the truths in Athens of the faith and bring it to bear on the culture and the ideas that were there. It is important for us to realize that Jesus Christ is the fulfillment of the promises and purposes of the Old Testament. Matthew, throughout his gospel, makes this clear. I'm not ashamed to proclaim and uphold this truth. But, and this is big, I recognize that if the Old Testament is not authoritative to someone, then I probably should not begin there. Or the same can be said of the New Testament. When it comes to sharing and proclaiming the truth, it is not about one tool for all jobs. In a way, I think this explains in part why we have four Gospels. They all proclaim the same Jesus and the same salvific truth, but not always in the same way.